Welcome to 2016 from the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroines, supervillains, and superheroes, and all the other super beings in Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Happy 2016, Drea.
Happy New Year, Brian.
We want to say that this year has actually started out with a bit of a bang. Of course, we had the holidays the last couple of weeks. Christmas was great. New Year's was great. You had a birthday. Happy birthday.
I did. Thank you so much.
And our good friend John Armstrong, on Twitter known as @CardJohn, he's a professional magician, had a birthday that was pretty special on January 2nd, just after New Year's. This is a guy who's got to be one of the biggest Batman fans I have ever known. I've known him for quite a long time. And he had a birthday party 2 years in the making. Drea, you were there. Explain a little bit about what you saw.
I was not there. Huntress was there.
Oh, Huntress was there. That is true.
Everybody at the party was dressed up as a superhero. It was a mandatory aspect of this party. You were not to be let in unless you were in a costume of a superhero that was pre-approved by the birthday boy. So it was indeed not just a spectacle, but just an amazing community of superheroes from Marvel, DC Comics.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome. It was like, you basically had 2 years to choose what character you wanted to be. And the one real stipulation was that he had to approve the character. There could be no doubles. So you could not have two Supermen or two Batmen.
Right.
Or, so we were just going around the entire night looking at each character, and it was awesome. You did an amazing Huntress.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit about where your costume came from.
I had the pleasure of working with Castle Corsetry, of course, famously known for their Star Wars bunnies, their DC Comics Marvel costumes, an amazing costume company, as well as Hoku Props, which my friend Chad runs. And we designed and created, essentially they created a costume that was, I would say, probably one of the best costumes I've ever worn when it comes to cosplay. But it was not just great to wear the costume, but to be around other people who were also in costumes that they, of characters that they really love. And then you have like Star-Lord dancing with Squirrel Girl and Batman and Catwoman, and you were Daredevil.
I was Daredevil. I needed a character that was a legit redhead because I'm a redhead. We've never seen a redhead play Daredevil. So I wanted to be Daredevil, even though my hair was completely covered all night by a mask that I made. So, at least I knew it and it was fine. But it was a lot of fun. It was a great deal of fun, and we want to wish John Armstrong a very happy birthday. You guys should check out John. He is a magician. You may have seen him on Penn and Teller's Fool Us, where he had his one of his signature tricks, Tiny Plunger, and did a spectacular job on Fool Us. Go check out his magic. So Drea, you and I are back in 2016. We're talking about Batman the Animated Series. And I think really there's no better writer to come back to than Paul Dini. If for no other reason than he's Paul Dini.
Every single episode that features Paul Dini's writing and creativity is great. I mean, some of course are better than others. Paul Dini tends to create episodes where he manages to include multiple well-known characters together, right? So multiple villains, multiple heroes, characters that we've gotten to know well. So he's just very talented at being able to bring a story together that features the ensemble without seeming like he's calling it in. Of course, he would never call it in. So, this is another one of those episodes where you go into it sort of thinking it's going to be about one character or one thing, and then you realize you're being reintroduced to people from the past.
Yeah, he's one of those writers that really it comes down to, I would imagine that some staff writers, not necessarily for this show, but other animated series, they would get a show where they needed to bring in a villain, and then it was just basically a cookie cutter type episode. I really get the impression that when Paul sits down to outline an episode, he's not only thinking about how great he could make this particular story and this plot, but also how many different characters could he actually bring into the fold. And when you're thinking about it from a behind the scenes point of view, that is, you're having to use character models from the various episodes. We're not talking about 3D CG characters that you just bring in and reanimate. You're basically like, okay, we need character models for the ventriloquist. We need it for Catwoman, Batman, and Veronica Vreeland comes back in this episode. And once again, she's throwing a party that doesn't exactly go the way that she planned. And with that, let's jump right into Catwalk. Drea, we are at a party at what appears to be a museum. And this is a museum that is very much like a Smithsonian type of museum, lots of taxidermied animals. Sadly, many of them are extinct. And this isn't necessarily a good thing, particularly when one of the guests at the party is none other than Miss Selina Kyle. And she is lamenting the fact that you've got all of these creatures that were at one time wild and vibrant, and now they are dead, stuffed, behind glass, in a cage, and she too feels caged. And all of that really comes down to she used to be free to do what she wanted. She used to be able to put on that cat suit, go out at night and steal jewels. And now she cannot. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that everyone in Gotham City knows who she is. So if you see Catwoman on the street, you know Selina Kyle is breaking parole or, whatever.
Right, because she was caught. Batman caught her in a previous episode. And the point is made here that she could be in jail. She could be incarcerated and would not have the freedom, the way that we think about freedom, generally speaking. Free will to walk about, to do whatever we want within the law, but certainly not caged up, not locked up, so to speak. So the point is made here in the beginning of the episode that she, although acknowledging that she's free, she feels fundamentally very trapped, very caged in and unable to express her authentic self, which, if anyone has ever felt that way, it's extremely, it can be distressing. It can be debilitating. It's a huge problem. And she is very clear to express this to Bruce Wayne.
Yeah, let's talk about where she has been prior to this episode. I mean, we've seen her go through quite a bit. In fact, in one of the more fantasy-driven episodes, she was physically turned into a cat-like,
that's right,
hybrid.
On the island of Dr. Moreau, she
right.
was turned into like this cat-human hybrid. And we were convinced that she might have been somewhat happy.
Which actually makes this particular line that much more poignant.
Poor baby. I used to be just like you.
Literally. She was just like that. She was just like that animal. But these are priceless animals, even dead and stuffed in a museum. And she isn't really all that thrilled about being at this party. And Bruce actually thinks this is quite rude. He listens to Selina as she basically tells him how she feels.
Extinction. I can relate to that.
You're in a cheery mood.
Giving up Catwoman hasn't been easy, Bruce. I miss the excitement, the danger. Sometimes I feel so tempted.
Even though you'd be risking prison?
Tell me I'm not in a cage now.
Drea, this is about the time that you would think, because Bruce knows she was Catwoman, and because Bruce has an alter ego of his own and knows what it means to have these impulses and these urges to put the cowl on and go out, even in the least convenient of times, and to maybe distance yourself from other people around you, and go out and fight crime, or go out and steal jewels, or go out and, you would think that Bruce could sort of act as a little bit of a mentor or as a sponsor in the best way that he could, without actually revealing that he's Batman. But instead, he just sort of turns around, goes back to the party, and lets her leave on her own.
What do you mean? So your expectation is that he would follow her, or he would try to console her in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think just being a gentleman, forget the fact that you're Batman. I think just being a gentleman, you would probably go and just console her. I mean, she is basically opening up to you, and she is telling you that she feels trapped and that she misses being Catwoman. I mean, this is a red flag right off the top. Her coming right out and saying she misses being a thief. She misses the freedom that she used to have for being a cat burglar. And she's talking to Batman. She doesn't know she's talking to Batman, but you would think that he would then turn and try to help her or therapize in some way, shape, or form.
Well, to take your point even further, she's essentially saying that she's in a lot of pain, and that she feels trapped.
Yeah.
And she doesn't like, it's painful to be in this situation based on the inability to be her true self, that her identity is really fragmented. And yes, he should be able to identify with all of these things. And to take it further, we may even, I mean, if I were him, I would worry about potential thoughts of self-harm. Might she hurt herself? Might she consider suicide? How painful is this pain? So I agree with you that he isn't quite empathic here. He's a little bit cold, and I wonder if it's because he has this black and white thinking, this really rigid thinking about criminality and heroism. Now, we've talked about this before, but in terms of not when it comes to himself, right? Because he breaks laws and he puts himself above the law, all sorts of gray area stuff that makes him more complex. But when he addresses her, he has always seen her as someone who breaks the law for a bad reason, to hurt others, to gain incentive for herself, not to help others. Whereas he puts on the cape and cowl to help others.
Well, I think he sees the things that she's done for animals and stuff as, as a mission and as a helpful mission. I think that's probably why he still holds her in such high regard. But you're right. He does have this sort of mentality of, if she were to put that costume back on, he would be disappointed in her. It's almost like I don't want to say paternal, because he clearly doesn't look at her like a father, but he's got that sort of parole officer mentality of he's keeping an eye on her. And what's interesting is at the end of this, as she's leaving the museum and he just turns around, he's got a very sad look on his face. Like, you can see that he wants to be able to help her, but then you get the sense that he doesn't really know how, and he leaves. Now, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it would simply be Batman has just turned on. Batman has kicked in. He is not interested in helping her by talking to her or by spending time with her to make sure she does not put on the Catwoman outfit. I think he is heading back to the Batcave to go grab the Batman costume so that he could actually go spy on her, because he is more interested in watching her and seeing if she'll cross that line than he is helping her any other way. He's more interested in catching her in a disappointing criminal act.
Right. And I think we've seen before how he doesn't intervene. He sort of observes.
He lets you make your mistake, and then he looks down on you for it. Yeah, it's kind of weird. I mean, maybe it's not weird, but to me, I was disappointed in Bruce for not being a little more empathic.
I think that's fair.
She leaves, and she is instantly swept up by a giant-looking thug, throws her into a car, and there she is speaking with a silhouetted figure and another little silhouetted figure on his lap. And as the light turns on, we see that it is none other than the ventriloquist. Drea, once again, we are hanging out with the ventriloquist and Scarface. And, we remember, I think maybe the last time we saw them was probably in the courtroom when Batman was on trial, maybe.
I believe so.
And clearly we knew that the ventriloquist had been recarving the head that was destroyed the first time that we saw him by his own thug and his machine gun. So we know that there's another little Scarface. Scarface is not gone. Now, let's revisit a little bit for people who don't necessarily remember where we were coming down in that last episode or that first episode with them. We were saying that the ventriloquist and Scarface were the same person.
Right.
It's not a supernatural thing that's happening.
Right. That Scarface, the dummy, even though
the figure.
Yes.
The ventriloquism figure.
Is that what they're officially?
Yeah.
The ventriloquism figure, Scarface, is not a separate entity, although in terms of his personality, he's so much different than the ventriloquist. He is violent and rude and impulsive and homicidal, and one could even argue deserved to be destroyed the way that he was in their episode. Whereas the ventriloquist is this mild-mannered, older, quiet man who is, in terms of his behavior, isn't impulsive or violent,
right?
Isn't, malevolent, doesn't seek to harm others, but instead has this relationship with Scarface. And
he almost seems to be as fearful of Scarface as anyone else, as any of the thugs or any of the victims. I mean, this guy is legitimately afraid of letting down Scarface or of Scarface getting hurt in any way, shape, or form.
Right. So we argued that not only is Scarface not this supernatural separate entity, it's also not manifestation of the ventriloquist's multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. That's the official name of that particular mental illness. We argued that that wasn't the case because the two identities essentially interact, actually quite emotionally and in some ways violently they interact.
Yeah, Scarface isn't particularly nice to his ventriloquist.
I mean, he's basically abusive.
I do as he says, ma'am. Mr. Scarface can be quite insistent. I don't think anyone's talking to you. No, sir. No, sir.
And so what we argued was that this was in a very, this was almost a severe representation of the ventriloquist's deeper urges or desires to integrate past trauma or to make sense of the helplessness that he feels. And so he's sort of created this character, this guy who will enact these atrocities and is in a way fundamentally fulfilling for the ventriloquist, which is why when he was incarcerated at Arkham Asylum, it felt fitting. We sort of felt bad for him, but we felt like ultimately he was the one that pulled the trigger.
Right.
He was the one that caused that mayhem. He was the one who had, willingly engaged in these atrocities. And so we look at the ventriloquist as the real villain, but we look at Scarface as sort of the component of that villainy.
Right.
And in a way, if you eliminate Scarface, you could essentially, help to sort of manage the ventriloquist's antisocial behavior. But as you
don't think that those urges would come out in some other way? Like, I mean, clearly it's bottled up. By eliminating the figure, you're not necessarily eliminating the urge, right?
Well, and as you said, he started to create him in the wood shop.
Right.
So it's probably insufficient to simply eliminate the body. But what I meant by that is to eradicate whatever that is that needs to create that character or that animosity, that negativity. And so here we're reintroduced to them, and this is like Scarface 2.0. This is like upgrade.
At least, yeah, probably. Yeah, at the very least. You know, we've seen Arnold Wesker, the ventriloquist. We've saw him with Scarface, what we're going to call 1.0, in the episode Read My Lips. But then we saw them again together in the courtroom, and now we are seeing them in this situation. So at the very least, this is 2.0. You know, we're assuming that there weren't many incarnations prior to the one that we saw in Read My Lips, and we're assuming that other inmates in Arkham haven't destroyed Scarface before.
Well,
No.
and as you'll point out, the staff at Arkham Asylum are more than happy to let their patients have
Absolutely. Nothing that
little-
will make you uncomfortable in any way. So, you know, you need a ventriloquist figure. We've got it right here. Here you go. You need that ventriloquist figure to have a loaded Tommy gun. Here, take it. We'll let him hold on to it. Okay, so Scarface basically proposes to Catwoman, who, by the way, has never met them before. As we were watching this episode, I find myself thinking, well, wasn't she in the courtroom? But she wasn't.
No.
That was Pamela Isley and other members of the Rogues Gallery. Catwoman wasn't there, so she's never seen Arnold Wesker and Scarface before, and she cracks up hysterically. You know, clearly they can't be serious, but they are very serious, and they propose a 50-50 split. She could go and steal the jewels that she saw in the museum, and they will help her out with, you know, basically a way to get in, get out without ever having been caught. And this becomes too much for her to pass up. So she goes ahead and goes through with it. And then that's when we find out that she has been set up by none other than Scarface. And she's almost killed in the process, just trying to escape. But
it doesn't. It's interesting. It doesn't take much convincing.
no, she's
In terms of,
she
like,
jumps right at it.
She's interested in it, and you think about, like, well, what's the incentive? Does she doesn't need them to break in, to, like, she can do this on her own.
So, Dre, let's talk about this. You started out by saying she is, she feels the need. She feels these impulses, these urges. And there you're saying it took her very little convincing to actually take the job. Let's talk about these impulses and these urges. Is she feeding an addiction? I mean, this would essentially be her going to a sponsor and saying, I'm feeling the need to drink, or I'm feeling the need to shoot heroin, or I'm feeling the need to whatever. That sponsor is sort of saying, don't worry, you'll be okay. Her going onto the street, and instantly someone with alcohol or someone with heroin is standing right there and saying, here you go.
Yeah, putting those analogies aside for a second and thinking about this in terms of just kind of the basic human psychology, I think that when it comes to her perception of freedom, the impulsiveness is very important, in that when we engage in impulsiveness, we're exercising our free will. We're exercising our freedoms, so to speak. So psychological studies do demonstrate that engaging in impulsiveness is essentially brings a sense of free will and freedom. It allows for a release of vigor and energy, and that is just sort of fundamentally a practice of experiencing the freedom that we have as human beings, fundamentally, right? On the other hand, impulsiveness can be dangerous, thinking about it in the extremes.
So what you're saying is she's not necessarily feeding a particular impulse to go commit crime. She is feeding simply the impulse to feel free. And, it's that freedom that she misses.
Right.
And by simply not being able to commit crime, she feels trapped.
Right. So the idea that limits have been imposed on her by other people, by the law, what have you, that is, it's constraint, right? And so to act out those urges, to give in to those urges, despite what those urges may be, is an exercise in experiencing freedom or free will. And, obviously there's the other side of this coin. Just thinking about like what happens to folks who are excessively impulsive, whether it's substances or illegal activity, it can usually get them into trouble, right? They violate social norms, they have disruptive relationships, they have difficulty holding down a job because of the dangers, of the threats, of what they're willing to introduce into their life because they're giving in to impulses. And it should be very clear, I don't have a psychodynamic approach to what I do, but despite that not being my modality, I can understand the theory that we are driven by human impulses and that we have to exercise management of that, right? I want a donut, I want pizza, I want ice cream, I want to drive down the 101 really fast, but I can't do those things in excess, right? Especially if I don't want to get a speeding ticket.
Right.
So every day we manage those impulses, and it's just a fact that some of us are quite good at self-regulation and some of us are not as good in self-regulation. And so you might argue that she is one of those people that has a lot of difficulty managing those impulses. To quote psychologist Charles Carver, consistent expression of impulses without regard to the future and the needs of others can adversely affect an individual. So we have an inherent biological danger. There's a ticking time bomb within us, and it's really up to us to safely approach incentives, but also to avoid threats on our lives, to avoid threats on our health, more deeply, to avoid threats on our social functioning, our relationships, our romantic relationships, our families, our professions. I mean, there's a lot of responsibility that we have.
Right. So as I said, she's nearly killed. She gets away. She ends up going back home. Batman ends up confronting her, asking her why she was there, and she comes up with some lame lie.
Look, I was there earlier for a party, and I kind of lost my temper. I went back to apologize, and the place was empty, except for the burglars. I happened to have my outfit in the car, and I thought if I nailed the robbers, I could work up some points with the cops. Maybe even with you.
He's willing to go with her on it. Now, I don't think that he believes her, but he's willing to go with her. And he takes her back to the museum and basically tries to work with her as a partner. The story unfolds, and she ends up once again betraying Batman.
You're not telling me something.
You know what's wrong with our relationship? You always let me get too close.
And she goes after Scarface herself because she realizes she's been betrayed. Scarface actually wants the rare animal taxidermy that is supposedly priceless or worth millions of dollars. He didn't want the jewels at all, and he was using her as a scapegoat, which I think is interesting because that means the puppet was acting as a bit of a puppet master. She was the puppet in this particular case. So it's a nice little bit of work there by Mr. Dini. But Batman goes after them. The entire thing ends up in a battle where essentially Catwoman is given the opportunity to, go with me on this, murder Scarface. Now, she doesn't believe Scarface is a supernatural entity. She doesn't believe that he is anything other than the conduit through which this stuff is coming out through, Wesker.
Right, but she's fingered him.
We don't know that happened. I don't know.
Sorry, I mean she's accusing him. She's identifying him as the figure who betrayed her, who abused her, used her, however you want to say that.
Well, no, she is accusing Arnold. He is trying to convince her that the two are separate entities. He's basically saying, no, you don't understand. This isn't me. I promise I would never hurt a human being, whatever. And she comes right out and says,
but he's inside you somewhere.
She drops a ton of logs, literally, on top of him, smashing Scarface once again. So again, he has just witnessed the death of Scarface.
Right.
And we get the sense that this might not be the last time that we end up seeing this. But Drea, I want to ask you about this interaction. She does this almost as a bit of torture toward him, toward the ventriloquist. But then also, I want to know your thoughts on his having witnessed it again, seeing that conduit taken away from him. How bad is that for someone to go through?
It's presented as if he's lost somebody, right? He's lost the partner in his life, however you want to take that, What seems different in this episode is that, compared to the first time he lost Scarface, he doesn't seem emotionally relieved from it. I feel like we picked up on that the first time. Whereas here, there seems to be, obviously there's grief and there's a lot of anger, but my assumption would be that there's a lot of emotional relief, that he no longer has to maintain that identity, that he can be himself and somehow integrate any of those feelings of negativity and hate and animosity towards others, which is all fine. Like, again, we can feel hate. We can even feel that we can't stand people so much that we may not want them to be on this earth. Like, feeling things isn't necessarily bad. Of course, what's bad is acting on those feelings and really authentically wanting to cause pain towards others. So I guess I would start to question, is he going to find consolation? Is he going to find some integration of those negative feelings? Or is this a complete loss? In other words, a traumatic experience for him in that he's seen a part of himself be destroyed.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that he is really going through something traumatic each and every time he sees this happen. But I'm also worried about the danger that could come from it with him not having an outlet.
So you think that it might be bottled up so much that it could endanger.
Yeah, because imagine if...
Brian, what could be more dangerous than Scarface?
Scarface unable to do anything until he's completed again. Imagine how angry Scarface will be the moment he can speak. Imagine how, once he finishes another version of this dummy and it's been bottled up for this amount of time, like, imagine the need. I mean, think about the urges that Catwoman has.
Right.
Or that Selina has, not being Catwoman until eventually she can be Catwoman again. Now imagine that Catwoman is a murderous mobster who can't do anything until he exists again. That to me is a terrifying thought, that someone isn't necessarily helping this man overcome this other, not necessarily identity, but this conduit, through which he gets out his aggression, right, and, all of that. Like, that to me is terrifying.
I agree. And to be clear, obviously the Scarface ventriloquist identity dynamic is fictional. You know, there are no cases like this in existence or historically, but I think that it is an extreme version of what can truly happen for folks who are, not expressing their authentic emotions in the moment, in appropriate ways, and by that I mean like socially appropriate, interpersonally appropriate. And so we do find that people have like anger management problems, for instance, or lash out or engage in extreme violence, in sudden rages, for instance, because they're unable to mediate those feelings. So the danger that you're talking about, I think that is it's quite on point. There's some realism to that. 100 points for Brian.
Okay, so this is the part that I find hilarious, and it might be a very simple way to end the episode, but I also think there might be a little bit more complexity to it from our point of view. And that is, after this whole thing is said and done, Batman is disappointed in Catwoman. He's about to take her to jail, and she takes this priceless Tasmanian tiger and throws it onto these flames. And she basically says, that thing is priceless. It belongs in the museum. It's the only one of its kind. That tiger is extinct. If that thing goes up, this museum and the world will lose this animal forever. You can either save that or you can take me in, but you can't do both. Batman, of course, saves the Tasmanian tiger. She escapes. And the last thing we see is her perched above the city, basically, and she's citing essentially the Rudyard Kipling poem.
I am the cat who walks by herself.
But she clearly sees herself as alone. But I want to talk about the fact that Batman goes after the priceless, quote unquote, object instead of taking her. Now, we know Batman has a tendency to let the women in his life go, no matter how bad the criminal act is. Do you think that's what he did here?
I don't get it. He can always find her. He knows she's Selina.
Right.
As soon as Selina is...
But do you think Selena's not going to go back to her house, her apartment, and sleep there tonight? Like, she's on the lam.
I don't know, but there is a scene where a cat licks her face, and I thought about our last episode.
About her. It's right after she takes a pretty dramatic fall, too. So, I too thought, did that cat just bring her back to life?
Yeah.
Let's talk about Selina now. She's in the cat suit. She is all alone. She knows that Batman is going to be hunting her. Where does she go from here emotionally?
Well, I would be hard pressed to say that she's better emotionally, that she is in a better place emotionally. I think she's still conflicted with her identity, and certainly with managing the impulses that she feels, and certainly resolving or trying to integrate the sense that she's misunderstood, the sense that she's not really able to be herself. So that's a huge issue. If we think about her as, kind of in the criminal sense, is she going to engage in criminal behavior again? We would look at what she's already done. And unfortunately, all signs point to returning to criminal activity. In some of the studies that look at impulsiveness and criminal behavior, when you expect to see return to criminal behavior, usually happens when you have not just impulsiveness, but also hostility. So those two things together, hostility and impulsiveness, which means, of course, kind of like a dangerous formula. And what researchers have found is that those individuals are likely to have very little learning experiences from punishment, meaning whether incarceration or some other means of punishment, like they don't learn from punishment. They don't change their behavior based on punishment. Mm-hmm. They have deficient moderating systems. That's just a fancy way of saying they have underdeveloped ways in which they can manage their self-control. Mm-hmm. So they lack control. And they're actually called under-controllers, meaning that they are not well equipped with controlling their behavior and tend to engage in impulsive behavior versus like premeditated, active, planful behavior. I think that Catwoman meets some of this criteria, but at the same time, what's unique about her is that she's really emotionally conflicted and is interested in healthy, positive relationships, especially in Batman, especially in other people. So I think that there's some hope for her in terms of what might drive her, her decisions. What did you think about this episode?
I thought the episode was great, and I really appreciated the fact that Dini wrote in that Kipling line at the end. That to me is it's actually one of my favorite pieces. When I was in college, I read that piece. Are you familiar with Rudyard Kipling's The Cat That Walked by Himself?
This is one of the poems that I think was like overshadowed by his other works.
Sure, yeah, because Kipling, of course, wrote The Jungle Book, and that's really one of the ones that people know most. But one of the things that I find fascinating about this particular story, it's a story about a cat that is essentially, like all cats, a loner out in the wild. He comes across a man and a woman who are also alone until they find each other, and then they end up living in a cave. And over the course of this time, the cat keeps coming back and seeing everything that's going on. And a number of other animals are incorporated. A cow is brought in for milk, and there's just all of this stuff that's going on. But the cat is never really entranced by any of this. He just sort of checks in, and then bolts, and then comes back the next night to find out what's going on. And then finally, the couple have a baby, and the baby is crying and can't sleep, and it's really frustrating the woman. And the cat ends up going up to the baby and rubbing itself against the baby, and the baby laughs and falls asleep. And the woman's very grateful, and the cat realizes, like, this is what I do. This is my job. I can purr and I can rub against the cat and, whatever.
Oh, it has purpose.
It does, sort of. What's interesting is there are all of these bargains that are being swapped between the animals and the people and, whatever. And by the end, they start putting restrictions on the cat. And the cat is sort of like begrudgingly saying, okay, fine. And the more and more the restrictions come, the more and more the cat is feeling a little more bound. And then late at night, the cat will leave the cave and will go wander alone. There's a cat, there's a bat, there are restrictions, there are threats that are carried out, and there's a cat that ends up walking by himself. I think that is amazing, because Paul Dini basically took that story and is like, look, you've got this cat that has these contracts, it's got these restrictions, but can't not get up and just walk alone.
Right.
And so, I thought that was absolutely fantastic. So to me, this was a really great story, great animation, really nicely done. And as we said in the beginning of the show, I think it's always great when you've got an opportunity to put Paul Dini in charge of lots of different characters. I mean, think about Batman really wasn't even in this episode very much.
No, and I think, as we've said in previous episodes, that oftentimes that makes for a good episode when he is sort of observing and participating, but more or less having us experience these characters and their stories. And I think you nailed it. I mean, I think that's really what this is about. We don't pathologize Selina Kyle. We don't, sort of perceive her or characterize her as antisocial, as, even as a criminal. I think we can sort of take those labels away and just understand her as a human being who simply wants to enjoy those natural human rights. And, I think it's a deeply layered episode because it has to do with our freedoms. Even if some of those desires or impulses are frowned upon. And I think what I took away from this episode was reflecting on the ventriloquist and Catwoman representing individuals who have these unmet needs. They have these emotionally unmet needs. I have, anger for other people in the world. I want to lash out at them, or I have impulses to have things that other people have. I mean, it really comes down to social class. It comes down to the haves and have-nots, and the idea that the resentment, the suffering, the anger that they have is manifesting in the ways that they are in a children's cartoon. Like,
Sure.
It's just so deep.
Yeah.
So
We've said that this show does time and time again. I mean,
Yeah.
countless episodes, so far have been considerably deeper than we ever imagined. And the fact that it was clearly designed for audiences, not just of 6 and 7 and 8 and 9-year-olds, but also people considerably older.
Yeah, it's another great one. So I really recommend this episode.
And with that, until next week, Drea, where can we find you?
I'm on Twitter. My handle is @ArkhamAsylumDoc, and my website is underthemaskonline.com.
You can find me on Twitter. I am @bward028. You can also email us. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com, or come find us on Twitter. We both man the Arkham Sessions account. We are @Arkham Sessions. You should definitely go follow our family over at Fanboy Comics. They are a fantastic group of folks who have a number of great comic books that you should be reading. They have a number of great podcasts you should be listening to. Do go check them out. They are fanboycomics.net, or you can follow them on Twitter @fanboycomics. On Twitter, comics is spelled with an X. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi,
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
What you laughing at? My fly ain't open, is it?